Vivek and Samir came from completely different worlds, yet destiny had brought them under the same roof. Vivek was a disciplined, serious, and highly focused young man who believed in structure, responsibility, and academic excellence. At the age of 24, he had already built a reputation for himself as someone who never compromised on his goals. On the other hand, Samir, just 21 years old, was the complete opposite of him. He believed in living life freely, enjoying every moment, and never overthinking the consequences of his actions. Where Vivek represented silence and control, Samir represented energy and spontaneity. Their personalities were like two different colors that never seemed to blend, yet life had placed them in the same frame. Their lives changed when their parents got married, making them stepbrothers. Neither of them had grown up together, nor did they share a childhood bond. They were practically strangers when they first met under the same roof. At first, there was distance between them, an invisible wall created by their differences and unfamiliarity. Both of them understood that they were not related by blood, yet society had placed them in a family relationship that required them to behave like brothers. This expectation created confusion in their minds, because internally they did not feel like siblings, but externally they had to act like one. In the beginning, their interactions were minimal and formal. Vivek stayed focused on his studies and personal goals, while Samir often tried to break the silence with small jokes or playful behavior. Sometimes Vivek would ignore him, and sometimes he would respond with irritation, but slowly time began to change things in subtle ways. Living under the same roof forced them to see each other more often, and gradually, familiarity replaced awkwardness. What started as indifference slowly turned into a strange kind of comfort. They began to understand each other's habits, routines, and moods. As days passed, something unexpected started developing between them. Not just companionship, but a silent emotional connection that neither of them could fully explain. They began to notice each other more than they should have. Small moments like sharing meals, sitting in the same room, or passing by each other in the hallway, started carrying an unspoken weight. Vivek, who was always calm and reserved, sometimes found himself distracted by Samir's presence. Samir, who was always playful and careless, sometimes became unusually quiet in Vivek's company. Without realizing it, they were slowly stepping into a bond that was deeper than friendship but confusing because of their so-called relationship as stepbrothers. Their hearts were beginning to respond to each other in ways their minds could not understand. Yet, both of them continued to ignore these feelings, convincing themselves that it was just adjustment and nothing more. As time continued to pass under the same roof, the distance between Vivek and Samir did not remain as sharp as it once was. The silence that used to dominate their interactions slowly started to dissolve into occasional conversations, and those conversations gradually turned into longer exchanges that neither of them really planned but somehow did not want to end. Vivek still remained disciplined and focused on his routine, but now there were moments when his concentration would break. Not because of distraction in general, but because of Samir's presence in the house. Samir, on the other hand, continued to live freely, but even his carefree nature started to adapt in subtle ways whenever Vivek was around. It was as if both of them were unknowingly adjusting themselves to a shared emotional space. At times, their small daily interactions carried more meaning than they intended. A simple exchange of glances across the dining table, or a casual question about the day, would sometimes linger in their minds longer than expected. Vivek would often catch himself thinking about Samir's words long after the conversation had ended, questioning why such small things were occupying his thoughts. Samir, too, would occasionally find himself pausing in the middle of his activities, remembering how Vivek had reacted to something he said, as if searching for approval or understanding without openly admitting it. Living together naturally brought moments where they had to spend time in shared spaces. Whether it was watching television in the evening, studying late at night in the same room, or simply sitting in silence, those moments began to feel different. Not uncomfortable, but not entirely normal either. There was an invisible tension, not of conflict, but of awareness. Both of them were becoming increasingly aware of each other in a way that went beyond ordinary familiarity. Yet neither of them had the courage to acknowledge it, even within their own thoughts. One evening, a simple incident shifted something subtle between them. The weather outside was warm, and Samir suggested they spend some time near the small pool area behind the house. Vivek initially hesitated, as he rarely engaged in such casual activities, but eventually agreed. The atmosphere was light at first, filled with normal conversation and light humor. Samir, as usual, tried to make Vivek relax, encouraging him to step out of his structured mindset and just enjoy the moment. Vivek, though reserved, found himself slightly more open than usual. In that brief period of ease, something unspoken passed between them. It was not a dramatic event, not something that could be easily described, but more like a shared moment of comfort that neither of them had experienced before. For a short while, Vivek forgot his strict boundaries, and Samir forgot his usual restlessness. They were simply two young men sharing a moment of peace without labels, expectations, or definitions. However, as quickly as such moments came, they also faded, leaving behind a strange sense of awareness. After returning inside, Vivek found himself unusually quiet. Samir, too, became thoughtful, though he tried to hide it behind casual behavior. But inside, both of them felt something shifting. It was not clear what it was, but it was undeniable that something between them was no longer the same. As days continued, emotional complexity began to grow quietly. Vivek started questioning his own feelings more deeply. He wondered why Samir's presence affected him so much, why his thoughts would drift toward him even when he was trying to focus on his studies or responsibilities. Samir, on the other hand, began to notice that his usual carefree attitude felt incomplete when Vivek was not around. He started seeking his presence without realizing it, finding excuses to talk, to sit nearby, or to engage in small conversations that had no real purpose but felt necessary to him. This growing emotional dependency slowly created confusion in both their hearts. They did not understand whether it was friendship, comfort, or something deeper that society would never easily accept. Yet, despite their confusion, neither of them distanced themselves. Instead, they moved closer in subtle ways, as if drawn by an invisible force they could not resist. One night, during a quiet conversation in the dim light of their shared space, Samir made a comment that stayed in Vivek's mind longer than expected. It was simple and casual, something about how he felt most comfortable when Vivek was around. Vivek did not respond immediately, but the words echoed in his thoughts long after the conversation ended. For the first time, he began to question not just the relationship they shared, but the emotions he himself was developing. At the same time, a sense of fear also began to grow within him. Fear of misunderstanding, fear of judgment, and fear of what it might mean if these feelings continued to deepen. Samir, though less restrained emotionally, also began to feel that something was changing in a direction that was difficult to define. Yet instead of pulling away, he seemed to move closer, as if he trusted the connection more than the confusion. Their bond was no longer simple. It had entered a space where silence spoke louder than words, and where even ordinary gestures carried unspoken meaning. Neither of them had confessed anything, yet both were already living in the shadow of emotions they did not fully understand. And as each day passed, that invisible connection only grew stronger, setting the foundation for something neither of them was prepared to name. As the days moved forward, the emotional distance between Vivek and Samir continued to shrink in ways neither of them could fully control or even properly explain. What once felt like simple adjustment under the same roof had now turned into something far more complicated and emotionally layered. They were no longer just two stepbrothers sharing a house. They had become two individuals quietly dependent on each other's presence, even if they never openly admitted it. Every passing day added another invisible thread between them, tightening the bond without permission, without warning, and without clarity. Vivek, who had always believed in logic, discipline, and emotional restraint, began to experience moments of internal conflict. He would sit for hours trying to focus on his studies or personal goals, but his thoughts would often drift towards Samir. It was not something he intentionally allowed, yet it kept happening. He started noticing how Samir's voice lingered in his mind after conversations, how his laughter echoed in the background of his silence, and how even his absence in the house created a strange emptiness that he could not ignore. For someone like Vivek, who had always been in control of his emotions, This new internal chaos was unsettling. Samir, on the other hand, was becoming increasingly expressive in subtle ways. He never directly spoke about what he felt deep inside, but his actions often revealed more than his words. He would look for reasons to stay near Vivek, whether it was asking small questions, sharing unnecessary updates about his day, or simply sitting in the same room without speaking. There was a comfort he found in Vivek's presence that he could not find anywhere else. Even when he tried to distract himself with friends, outings, or casual activities, his mind would still return to the quiet presence of Vivek waiting at home. One evening, their emotional dynamic was subtly tested when Samir returned home slightly later than usual after spending time with his college friends. The house was quieter than normal, and Vivek was sitting alone in the living room, absorbed in his thoughts. When Samir entered, there was a brief pause between them, a moment that seemed ordinary on the surface but carried an unspoken weight underneath. Vivek looked up briefly, and Samir smiled casually, but something about that silence felt different. It was not uncomfortable, but it was charged with awareness. Samir began talking about his day, mentioning his friends, the laughter, and the casual environment of college life. Vivek listened quietly, responding only when necessary. But somewhere in the middle of the conversation, Samir noticed a subtle change in Vivek's expression. It was not obvious, but there was a slight shift, something that looked almost like discomfort or perhaps something closer to unease. Samir paused and asked if everything was all right, but Vivek simply nodded, avoiding deeper explanation. That night, after the conversation ended, both of them remained awake longer than usual. Vivek lay in silence, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand why he felt restless. It was not jealousy in a direct sense, but something close to it, an unfamiliar discomfort when Samir spoke about others, when he mentioned friends, or when he described moments where Vivek was not present. He struggled to understand this feeling because it did not fit into any category he was familiar with. It was neither anger nor sadness, but something softer and more confusing. Samir, too, lay awake thinking about Vivek. He began to wonder why Vivek's reactions mattered to him so much. Why did he feel a need to explain himself? Why did he notice even the smallest changes in Vivek's mood? These questions did not have answers that satisfied him. Instead, they created more curiosity, more emotional pull, and more confusion. The next few days carried a subtle tension between them. It was not visible to others, but for them it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Small conversations felt heavier than before. Glances lasted a little longer. Silence felt a little deeper. Even ordinary routines, like having meals together or passing each other in hallways, began to feel emotionally charged. They were both aware of this change, but neither of them had the courage to address it directly. One afternoon, during a quiet moment when they were both at home, Samir tried to lighten the mood by teasing Vivek as he usually did. But this time, Vivek did not respond in the same way. Instead, he remained unusually quiet. That silence created a shift in Samir's expression. He stopped smiling and asked softly if something was bothering him. Vivek hesitated, as if fighting an internal battle, but eventually said nothing. That silence, however, spoke louder than any words. Later that night, Samir found Vivek sitting alone on the terrace, looking at the sky. The atmosphere was calm, with a soft breeze moving through the quiet surroundings. Samir approached slowly and sat beside him. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with everything they had not said for days, weeks, or perhaps even longer. Finally, Samir broke the silence in a gentle voice, asking Vivek what he was thinking about so deeply. Vivek hesitated again, as if searching for the right words that would not expose too much of his inner world. After a long pause, he simply said that life sometimes becomes complicated without reason. Samir looked at him carefully, sensing that there was more behind those words, but he did not push further. Instead, he said something simple, something honest, that whatever happens, he feels calmer when Vivek is around. Those words once again created a quiet impact on Vivek's heart. He did not respond immediately, but his expression softened slightly. It was becoming increasingly difficult for him to separate logic from emotion whenever Samir spoke like this. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them again. Not a confession, not a declaration, but an understanding that their bond had reached a point where silence itself had become meaningful. They both realized, even if only partially, that their relationship was no longer something they could define easily or ignore casually. And yet, despite this realization, neither of them stepped back. Instead, they remained in that uncertain space together, where emotions were growing faster than understanding, and where every passing day was pulling them deeper into a connection they still did not have a name for. The emotional tension that had been building quietly between Vivek and Samir over the past days had now reached a point where it could no longer remain hidden under routine conversations or silent understanding. Something had fundamentally changed in the way they looked at each other, even if neither of them had openly defined it. It was no longer just comfort or companionship. It had become an emotional dependency that neither of them fully understood, yet both had started to accept in their own silent ways. The bond between them was now too deep to ignore, but still too confusing to name. Vivek found himself struggling more than ever with his thoughts. His mind, once disciplined and structured, now constantly drifted towards Samir without permission. Even during his most focused moments, Samir's presence would interrupt his concentration. It was not just about physical presence anymore. It was the memory of his voice, the softness in his tone when he spoke sincerely, and the way he looked at Vivek when he thought no one was paying attention. Vivek began to realize that this was not something he could simply dismiss or categorize as temporary confusion. It was persistent, growing, and deeply rooted. Samir, on the other hand, had become more emotionally open, though still not fully expressive in words. He had started to notice how much he relied on Vivek's reactions to feel stable. If Vivek was quiet, Samir felt uneasy. If Vivek seemed distant, Samir felt restless. And if Vivek showed even the slightest warmth, it stayed with him for the entire day. Slowly, without realizing it, Samir had started shaping his emotional world around Vivek's presence. It was no longer just affection or attachment. It had become something more consuming. One evening after dinner, the house was unusually quiet. Their parents were occupied with their own matters, leaving Vivek and Samir alone in the shared living space. The silence between them that night felt heavier than usual. Vivek was sitting near the window, lost in thought, while Samir kept glancing at him, as if waiting for the right moment to say something he had been holding back for a long time. The atmosphere felt different, like a turning point was approaching, even if neither of them knew exactly what it would be. Finally, Samir stood up and walked slowly toward Vivek. His steps were calm but deliberate, as if he had already made a decision in his mind. He stopped a short distance away and looked at Vivek quietly for a moment. Vivek noticed him and turned slightly, sensing the seriousness in his expression. That brief eye contact carried more weight than any conversation they had ever had before. Samir spoke first, his voice softer than usual, lacking its usual playful tone. He said he had been thinking a lot lately, about them, about their bond, and about the way everything had slowly changed between them. Vivek listened without interrupting, his heart already beginning to react before his mind could process the words. Samir continued, saying that he could no longer pretend that everything was normal or simple, because what he felt was no longer something he could ignore. Vivek felt his breath slow down. He knew this moment was important, but he did not yet know where it was leading. Samir hesitated for a second, as if gathering courage, and then admitted that Vivek meant more to him than just a family connection. He did not fully define it, but his words carried a depth that was impossible to misunderstand. It was not spoken loudly or dramatically. It was quiet, honest, and vulnerable. For a long moment, Vivek said nothing. His silence was not rejection, nor acceptance, but internal conflict. He had spent so long trying to understand his own emotions that hearing them reflected back by Samir created an overwhelming stillness inside him. His thoughts scattered, but his heart remained fixed on the reality unfolding in front of him. He finally looked away, struggling to find words that could balance logic and emotion. When Vivek finally spoke, his voice was calm but heavy. He admitted that he had been feeling the same confusion for a long time. He said that he had tried to ignore it, tried to define it in simple terms, but nothing had worked. What he felt could not be neatly categorized, and that uncertainty had been haunting him. His honesty, though hesitant, opened a space between them where truth could finally exist without pretense. Samir stepped a little closer, not forcefully, but naturally, as if drawn by the gravity of the moment. He said that he did not want to lose what they had, but he also could not continue pretending that it was just ordinary. He asked Vivek directly, not for an answer about labels or definitions, but for honesty, whether Vivek felt the same emotional pull that he did. Vivek closed his eyes briefly, as if trying to steady himself. When he opened them, there was a quiet acceptance in his expression. He did not fully define his feelings, but he did not deny them either. That silence, filled with understanding, was enough for Samir to read what words could not express. For the first time, both of them acknowledged the emotional truth between them, not as something planned, not as something logical, but as something that had grown naturally and uncontrollably over time. Yet even in this moment of acceptance, there was hesitation. Because alongside their feelings came the reality of their world, their family, society, and the identity they had been given as stepbrothers. That realization created a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The warmth of emotional acknowledgement was now mixed with fear and uncertainty. Vivek stepped back slightly, breaking the closeness, as if reminded of the boundaries that existed outside their private world. Samir understood immediately, not with disappointment, but with awareness. They both knew that what they felt could not exist freely in the way they had just experienced it. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer just emotional, it was thoughtful, cautious, and heavy with consequence. Neither of them regretted what had been said, but both understood that this was not the beginning of something simple. It was the beginning of something complicated, something that would require decisions, sacrifices, and possibly secrecy. Samir finally spoke again, this time more softly. He said that whatever they decide, he does not want to lose Vivek. Vivek looked at him and replied that he also does not want distance between them, no matter what happens. In that moment, without any formal agreement, they silently accepted that their bond would continue, but in a way that would not be visible to the world around them. Just confused about their emotions, they were now aware of them. And with that awareness came both closeness and caution, attraction and fear, connection and secrecy. They had crossed an invisible line, and even though they had not fully stepped into a defined relationship, they could no longer return to the simplicity they once had. From that night onward, everything between Vivek and Samir carried a new meaning, silent, hidden, and deeply emotional. And both of them knew, even without saying it aloud, that this was only the beginning of a much deeper and more complicated journey. As the night grew deeper, they both returned to their respective spaces in the house, but nothing felt the same anymore. Something had changed permanently. They were no longer. After that night, everything between Vivek and Samir changed, but nothing changed openly. On the surface, their routine remained the same. They still lived under one roof, shared meals, and spoke casually when needed. To anyone watching from outside, nothing unusual could be noticed. But inside their private world, everything had become more complex, more silent, and more emotionally intense than ever before. Vivek began to live in a constant state of inner conflict. His mind was no longer calm like before. Every time he looked at Samir, he was reminded of the emotional truth they had acknowledged, yet could not openly define. He started overthinking even the smallest moments between them. A simple glance, a brief conversation, or even a shared silence now felt heavier than it should have. He constantly questioned himself, whether what he felt was right, whether it could ever be accepted, and what would happen if anyone in the family ever sensed the truth. Samir, too, was going through a similar emotional turbulence, though he expressed it differently. He tried to act normal in front of others, maintaining his usual carefree personality. But when he was alone, his thoughts would drift toward Vivek. He found it difficult to separate his emotions from reality. The comfort he felt around Vivek had now turned into something deeper and more complicated, something that made him both emotionally dependent and internally confused. The house itself began to feel different. Even ordinary silence seemed louder than before. There were moments when both of them would sit in the same room without speaking, fully aware of each other's presence, yet choosing silence over conversation. It was not discomfort, it was awareness. A constant awareness that something had changed between them forever, even if the world around them remained unchanged. One afternoon, a small incident created an unexpected emotional wave between them. Vivek was sitting alone, reading, when Samir entered the room. He paused for a moment, as if deciding whether to speak or not. Finally, he casually asked a simple question about Vivek's day. Vivek replied normally, but there was a brief hesitation in his tone that Samir immediately noticed. That small pause, that slight difference in voice, carried more meaning than the entire conversation itself. Samir sat down quietly for a while, observing Vivek without saying much. He realized that Vivek was trying harder than ever to maintain emotional control, but it was not as effortless as before. Something inside him was constantly working, constantly thinking, constantly struggling. Samir understood that the emotional balance between them had become fragile. One wrong moment, one misunderstood gesture, could change everything again. Later that evening, Vivek stepped out to the terrace alone, trying to clear his thoughts. The night air was calm, but his mind was not. He kept replaying everything that had happened in recent days, trying to make sense of it. He was not afraid of Samir himself, but he was afraid of the situation they were in. The confusion, the emotional dependency, and the fear of judgment were all mixing together inside him. After a few minutes, Samir also came to the terrace. He did not say anything at first. He simply stood beside Vivek, looking at the sky. The silence between them was familiar now, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken understanding. Finally, Samir spoke softly, saying that he feels things have become complicated, but he does not want distance between them. Vivek did not respond immediately, but he nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth of those words. In that moment, both of them understood something very important. They could not go back to what they were before, but they also could not move forward openly. They were stuck in between, in a space where emotions existed but definitions did not. A space where they could feel everything but say very little. And so, without any agreement, they silently chose to continue as they were, close but careful, connected but hidden, emotional but controlled. It was not a solution. It was only a compromise. And deep inside, both of them knew that this silence would not last forever, because emotions that strong always demand an answer eventually.